They invited a human to speak about peace, and brought weapons to listen. That was the first thing he noticed when he stepped into the chamber. Not the scale of it, not the architecture, not even the fact that every major species in the sector was present. It was the weapons, hidden, subtle, integrated into armor, into limbs, into the very posture of the delegates themselves. No one here trusted the idea of peace enough to arrive unarmed. And yet, they had still invited him. A human. That alone said everything. He walked forward without hesitation. Measured steps, straight posture, no visible concern. To them, he looked calm. To himself, he looked exactly like someone who understood the odds and chose to stand anyway. The chamber quieted as he reached the central platform. Not out of respect, not yet. Out of curiosity. Humans were still new to this level of diplomacy. Observed more than understood. Judged more than trusted. Some saw them as fragile. Others saw them as unpredictable. Very few saw them as equals. He placed his hands lightly on the edge of the podium, letting his gaze move across the assembly. No challenge. No submission. Just acknowledgement. That was important. Humans had learned quickly that how you stood in a room like this mattered more than what you said. You asked for a human perspective, he began. His voice carried cleanly. Not loud. Not forceful. But controlled in a way that demanded attention without asking for it. So I'll give you one. A few of them shifted. Subtle reactions. Disinterest from some. Skepticism from others. And in the far rows, stillness. That was where the real danger sat. The ones who didn't react at all. He continued. You've spent cycles debating conflict, he said. Defining territory. Measuring strength. Preparing for outcomes you claim you don't want. No emotion. Just fact. And yet you invited us. That drew a reaction. Small. But noticeable. Because it was true. Humans weren't the strongest. They weren't the most advanced. They weren't even the most politically established. But they were something else. They were persistent. And that means, he went on, you're not certain your way works. Silence settled more firmly now. Not forced. Chosen. He didn't rush. Didn't try to fill it. He let it sit. That was another human trait the others hadn't fully understood yet. Comfort with discomfort. We come from a world where conflict wasn't optional, he said. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't distant. A few heads turned. More attention now. Survival required cooperation long before it allowed division. That landed. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was simple. True. And impossible to dismiss. He shifted slightly, not out of nerves, but to reset his stance. Ground himself. You see peace as an agreement, he said. Something negotiated. Signed. Maintained. A pause. We see it as a decision. That line held. It didn't need volume. It didn't need emphasis. It carried weight on its own. Because it reframed everything. Agreements can be broken. Decisions have to be changed. And changing them requires something deeper. Something harder. The room was fully attentive now. Even the ones who had dismissed him earlier. Even the ones who had expected this to be a formality. He continued, steady. You prepare for war because you believe it's inevitable, he said. We prepared for survival because we didn't have that luxury. Another shift. More stillness. No movement. No interruption. That was good. It meant they were listening. Or at least, processing. You measure strength in what a species can do to others, he said. We learn to measure it in what we can endure. That line changed the tone. Subtly. But undeniably. Because endurance is harder to quantify. Harder to counter. Harder to dismiss. He let his gaze move again, not challenging, just present. You think peace is weakness, he said. Because it requires restraint. A pause. We think it's strength. Because it requires choice. That was when the tension shifted. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But enough. Enough to know that something in the room didn't like where this was going. He felt it. Not through movement. Through absence of it. Stillness in one direction that didn't match the rest. Focused. Fixed. He didn't look directly at it. Didn't need to. Years of experience had taught him that attention wasn't always something you gave. Sometimes, it was something you survived. He continued anyway. Because stopping would confirm it. And that's why you don't trust us, he said. Now he let the line land. Fully. Direct. You don't trust a species that can endure what you avoid, and still choose not to use it against you. That was the closest he came to a challenge. Not aggressive. Not confrontational. Just undeniable. Silence deepened. Heavy now. Not just attentive. Tense. Because now they understood what he was saying. And more importantly, what he wasn't saying. Humans weren't harmless. They were choosing to be restrained. And that choice was what made them unpredictable. He took a slow breath, steadying his voice, not because it was failing, but because the moment mattered. This isn't a request, he said. Carefully. This is an observation. He shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself again. You can continue preparing for war, he said. You can continue building systems designed to outmatch each other. A pause. Or you can decide that survival doesn't have to be earned through conflict. That was the line. The one everything had been building toward. Not dramatic. Not loud. But final. Complete. And for a moment, it held. Perfectly. The room was silent. Every eye on him. Every system still. Every thought. Focused. Then, something moved. Fast. Too fast. A flash of motion from the edge of the chamber. A sharp, contained burst of energy. An impact. He felt it before he processed it. A force driving through his side, tearing through balance, through breath, through everything that kept him upright. The world shifted. Not spinning. Compressing. Sound dropped out for a fraction of a second, replaced by something distant, muted, unreal. His body reacted. Instinct. Muscle tightening. Weight shifting. Trying to compensate for something it didn't understand yet. He staggered. One step. Then another. Hands gripping the podium harder than before. Not by choice. By necessity. The room erupted. Movement. Voices. Systems activating. But none of it reached him clearly. Because his focus had narrowed to one thing. Stay standing. That was it. Not the pain. Not the damage. Not the fact that something had just gone very, very wrong. Just, don't fall. Because falling would end it. Not just the speech. Everything. He drew in a breath. Sharp. Controlled. Forced. His vision steadied just enough to lock back onto the chamber. Still there. Still watching. Still waiting. They expected him to collapse. He could see it. In their posture. In their movement. In the way attention shifted from listening to reacting. That expectation was the moment, and he understood it instantly. If he stopped now, they were right. If he fell, everything he said became irrelevant. So he didn't. He tightened his grip on the podium, adjusted his stance, forced his balance back into alignment, and continued. Conflict, he finished. Like nothing had happened. The word came out strained, lower, but clear, audible, real. The room didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react, because something had just broken their understanding of how this was supposed to go. He didn't look at the wound, didn't acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would make it real in a way he couldn't afford. Instead, he spoke again, steady, deliberate, unstopped. And in that moment, the speech didn't end. It changed. He didn't stop. That was the first thing that broke them. Not the shot. Not the impact. Not even the fact that a weapon had been fired in the middle of a controlled diplomatic assembly. It was the fact that the human didn't fall. He finished the word, kept his balance, and kept speaking. For a moment, no one understood what they were seeing. Because the sequence was wrong. The expected order had been simple: attack, collapse, silence. Instead, what they got was attack, stagger, continuation. That last part didn't fit. His voice dropped slightly, rougher now, forced through tightened control, but it carried. Doesn't have to be earned through conflict. The sentence completed, clean, intact, like nothing had interrupted it. That was when the noise died. Not gradually, instantly. The chamber, which had erupted in movement and reaction, snapped back into silence, not because the danger was gone, but because something far more unsettling had replaced it. He was still speaking, and that changed everything. Several of the delegates had already half risen from their positions. Defensive systems had begun to activate. Internal protocols were shifting toward containment. Then they stopped, because stopping the human now felt wrong. Not politically, not strategically, instinctively. Their attention locked onto him again. Not the attacker, not the guards, him. He adjusted his stance again, just enough to remain upright. The movement was subtle, controlled, but it cost him. Anyone trained to read biological responses could see it: the tightening of muscles, the slight delay in correction, the forced alignment of weight. Damage. Significant. And yet, functional. He drew another breath. Slower this time. Measured. And continued. "You rely on escalation," he said, voice quieter, but more focused. "You respond to threat with greater threat. No tremor. No panic. Just compression. Everything unnecessary stripped away. And you call that stability." A flicker of movement passed through the chamber. Not disruption. Disbelief. One of the council's internal systems activated a passive scan. It wasn't authorized. It wasn't announced. But it happened anyway. Because what they were seeing required confirmation. The data returned instantly. Impact confirmed. Penetration depth, critical. Internal disruption, severe. Projected outcome: loss of structural integrity. Collapse. Cessation. None of it matched reality. Because he was still standing. Still speaking. "You think survival is about removing the threat," he said. Another breath. Controlled. Tighter now. "We learned it's about outlasting it." That line shifted something deeper. Because it aligned with what they were now witnessing. Not theory. Not philosophy. Proof. A few of the delegates leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in analysis. Their attention sharpened, focusing on micromovements, on vocal stability, on physiological indicators. They weren't listening to the words alone anymore. They were studying the act of continuing. His hand tightened slightly against the podium, not enough to draw attention, but enough to stabilize. The pressure transferred through his arm, redistributing strain, compensating for imbalance. Adaptation. Immediate. Untrained species didn't do that. Unprepared species couldn't. "You prepared for this," one of them murmured, low enough that it barely carried. Another responded just as quietly. "No. This is response." That distinction mattered. Prepared meant expected. Response meant natural. Instinctive. Which made it more dangerous. He shifted his weight again. Another micro-adjustment. Another correction. His body was compensating faster than it should have been able to. And the chamber noticed. Every movement was now data. Every breath. Evidence. "You measure resilience in what survives the first strike," he said, voice tightening just slightly at the edges. A pause. Then, "We measure it in what continues after." That line landed harder than anything before. Because it wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't a concept. It was happening in front of them. Real time. Undeniable. The guards hadn't moved. Not because they were ineffective. Because they didn't know what to do. Intervening now would disrupt something they no longer understood. Neutralizing the attacker felt secondary. Stopping the human felt impossible. So they waited. And that waiting allowed the moment to grow. The attacker, positioned at the edge of the chamber, remained still as well. not hidden, not fleeing, watching, because even they didn't understand the outcome of their own action anymore. The human turned slightly, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to shift his focus across the chamber again. Re-engaging, reclaiming attention. You wanted to test the outcome, he said. That was new. Direct. Not accusatory, but pointed. So now you have it. His voice didn't rise. Didn't harden. If anything, it became more controlled, more precise, as if pain had narrowed everything down to only what mattered. And this is the part you don't account for. Another breath. Slower. Deliberate. We don't stop. Silence. Absolute. Because that statement was no longer theoretical. The scan systems updated again. Blood loss increasing. Structural integrity decreasing. Motor function still active. Cognitive function fully intact. No known model supported this. No species in the chamber matched this pattern. They began cross-referencing. Rapidly, quietly, desperately, because if this was standard human response, their entire understanding of the species was incomplete. And that was dangerous. He adjusted his stance one more time. This time the delay was visible. Small. But present. The strain was catching up. The cost accumulating. But he compensated. Forced correction. Forced alignment. Still standing. You think a single action defines the outcome, he said. And that's why you escalate so quickly. A pause. Shorter now. More controlled. We don't. His hand released from the podium for a fraction of a second, then returned. Recentering. Stabilizing. We absorb it, he said. The word carried weight. We continue. Another pause. We adapt. Each word slower. More deliberate. More grounded in what was happening. Not rhetoric. Reality. The chamber didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Because interruption no longer felt possible. Because this wasn't just a speech anymore. It was demonstration. And demonstrations change understanding. You fired, he said. That line shifted attention again. Not to the guards. Not to the systems. To the attacker. Positioned at the edge. Still present. Still watching. And you expected an ending. A pause. Then. You got a continuation. That was the moment the shift completed. Not in him. In the room. Because they realized something fundamental. This wasn't resilience as they defined it. This wasn't resistance. This wasn't recovery. This was something else entirely. A refusal to follow the expected outcome. And that was harder to counter than any weapon. He straightened slightly. Just enough to reassert presence. Just enough to remove any illusion of instability. And in doing so, he changed the balance of the room. Not through force. Not through threat. Through continuation. And for the first time since the shot, no one in that chamber believed this was under control anymore. Not theirs. Not the attackers. His. They understood it now. Not completely, but enough. This wasn't survival the way they defined it. This wasn't resistance. This was control. Control under damage. Control under pressure. Control when the outcome should have already been decided. And that realization spread faster than any alarm could have. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't shift into aggression. Didn't acknowledge the pain that was now clearly threading through every movement. He simply stepped forward. One step. Slow. Measured. And that single step changed the entire chamber. Because now, he wasn't just enduring. He was advancing. Several delegates recoiled slightly, not out of fear of attack, but from something less familiar. Uncertainty. Because forward movement meant intent. And intent in this condition didn't make sense. Another step. His balance adjusted again, compensating for instability that should have taken him down already. The delay in correction was more visible now, but it didn't stop him. It only slowed him, which somehow made it worse, because slow meant deliberate. Deliberate meant choice. And choice meant this was still under his control. Internal systems across the chamber spiked again. New scans initiated. Deeper this time. More invasive. They needed to understand what they were seeing. Results returned in fragments. Circulatory instability. Structural compromise. Neurological strain. All consistent with collapse. All contradicted by reality. He should not be moving, one observer transmitted quietly. He is not moving, another replied. A pause. He is continuing. That distinction settled heavily. Because continuation implied direction. And direction implied purpose. He didn't look at the wound. Didn't reach for it. Didn't even acknowledge its existence. All of his focus remained outward. Forward. On the chamber. On the assembly. On the one who had acted. Another step. Closer now. The distance shrinking. The space between speaker and attacker collapsing into something immediate. The guards reacted. Not aggressively, but instinctively shifting position. Not to stop him. To track him. To be ready for something they couldn't define. Because this no longer fit any known behavioral pattern. You initiated force, he said, voice tighter now, each word measured against the strain behind it. Not louder. More precise. And you expected it to end the conversation. Another step. The attacker didn't move. Didn't retreat. But the stillness had changed. Before, it had been controlled. Now, it was uncertain. You calculated outcome, he continued. Another breath. Shallow now. But controlled. You predicted silence. He stopped. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. Because he had reached the distance where stopping mattered. Close enough that the separation no longer protected either of them. The chamber held. Every system. Every eye. Every thought. Locked onto the point where expectation had failed. He looked directly at the attacker now. Not with anger. Not with hostility. But with something far more difficult to process. Clarity. You were wrong. The words didn't carry force. They carried certainty. And certainty, in that moment, weighed more than any weapon. The attacker's posture shifted, just slightly. A recalibration. A delayed response to a situation that had already moved beyond its initial parameters. Because nothing about this was proceeding correctly. Nothing aligned with projected outcomes. The human should have collapsed. The speech should have ended. The chamber should have transitioned into containment protocols. Instead, everything had stalled around him. He moved again. Not a step this time. A reach. Controlled. Unhurried. His hand closed around the attacker's arm. Not violently. Not suddenly. But with a firmness that left no ambiguity. And for a fraction of a second, no one reacted. Because the action didn't match any escalation pattern they recognized. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't restraint. It was something else. Something intentional. He pulled. Not sharply. Not forcefully. Just enough to break the attacker's position. To bring them forward. Out of the edge. Into the center. Into the same space he had been holding alone. The guards shifted instantly now, but still didn't intervene. Because stopping him meant choosing a side. And no one was ready to do that yet. The attacker resisted, briefly. A reflex. A reaction. But it didn't hold. Not because the human was stronger. Because the moment had already shifted. Because resistance now meant acknowledging loss of control. And that had already happened. He guided them forward. Step by step. Until they stood at the same position. The same platform. The same place where the speech had begun. Where it had been interrupted. Where it was still continuing. Then he released them. Not abruptly. Not dismissively. Deliberately. Like placing something exactly where it needed to be. The chamber didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't breathe. Because now. They were both there. The one who had tried to end it. And the one who refused to stop. He turned slightly. Not away, not fully, but enough to include both the attacker and the assembly in his focus. Recentering. Reframing. taking control of the narrative without raising his voice. You wanted to be heard, he said. The line cut clean. No excess. No emotion layered over it. Just fact. He gestured. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just a small motion toward the space they now occupied. Stand here. A pause. Short. Precise. Face what you tried to end. The words settled into the chamber like weight. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because this wasn't punishment. It wasn't retaliation. It was exposure. The attacker stood still. Not restrained. Not forced. But held in place by something far more effective than physical control. The moment itself. Because leaving now would confirm failure. And staying meant confronting it. The human didn't look away. Didn't step back. Didn't reclaim distance. He stayed exactly where he was. Despite the strain. Despite the visible cost now threading through every controlled movement. Because stepping back would release the pressure. And pressure was what made this real. The chamber's systems quieted. Not deactivated. Pause. Because intervention now would disrupt something larger than protocol. Something that was already redefining the situation. This is where it happens, he said. Quiet. Measured. Not to the attacker. Not to the guards. To everyone. This is where the decision is made. Another breath. Tighter. But still controlled. You chose action. A slight shift in posture. Recentering again. I choose continuation. That line held. Because it wasn't just spoken. It had been demonstrated. Every second since the shot. Every step forward. Every word after impact. All of it leading here. The chamber didn't respond. Didn't interrupt. Because there was nothing to add. Nothing to challenge. The outcome had already shifted. And they were still catching up to it. He straightened again, barely. Just enough. Holding the position. Holding the moment. And in doing so, he made one thing absolutely clear. The attack hadn't ended anything. It had given him control. No one spoke. Not the council. Not the guards. Not even the one who had fired. Because there was nothing left to interrupt. The moment had already been taken. He stood there, breathing slower now, each breath more controlled than the last. Not because it was easy, but because control was the only thing holding everything together. The chamber felt different. Not tense. Not chaotic. Defined. Like a line had been drawn and no one was willing to cross it without understanding what it meant first. He didn't move away from the attacker. Didn't reclaim distance. Didn't step back into safety. Because safety wasn't the point anymore. Understanding was. You wanted an outcome, he said quietly. His voice wasn't strong. It didn't need to be. Every word carried because of what had already happened. You thought you could force one. A slight pause. No reaction. No denial. Because denying it would require control. And control had already shifted. He turned his attention outward again, including the entire chamber without changing his position. You built systems around escalation, he continued. You trained yourselves to respond faster, strike harder, end things before they could continue. A breath. Measured. Tight. And you call that strength. Another pause. But strength doesn't come from ending something quickly. His posture held, even as the strain became visible in the smallest ways, the delay between breath and word, the subtle tightening before each shift. It comes from deciding what happens after it should have ended. That line settled deep, because it reframed everything they had just witnessed, not as resistance, not as survival, as choice. The attacker remained where he had been placed, not restrained, not forced, but unable to step away from the weight of what had just been proven. The human didn't look at him now. Didn't need to. The point had already been made. You fired, he said. Simple. Direct. You acted. A pause. And you expected that to define the outcome. His head tilted just slightly, not in challenge, but in clarity. It doesn't. Silence pressed in again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was understanding forming. Slow. Uncomfortable. But real. You don't control what happens after, he continued. We do. That word carried differently now. Not as a claim. As evidence. Because every second since the shot had reinforced it. He shifted his stance one final time. Not to advance. Not to retreat. To hold. To remain exactly where the moment required him to be. That's the difference, he said. You end things. A breath. Controlled. We continue them. The chamber didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Because the distinction had become impossible to ignore. Ending was immediate. Continuation required will. And will was harder to measure. Harder to counter. Harder to stop. The council members exchanged no visible signals, but their focus had changed completely. Not on threat. Not on containment. On reassessment. Because everything they thought they understood about humans had just been challenged in real time. Not through force. Through endurance. Through control. Through refusal. The human let the silence stretch just long enough. Not to dominate it. To let it settle. To let it become part of the message. Then he spoke again. Softer. But clearer than anything before. This is what peace actually looks like. That line shifted the meaning of everything that came before it. Not weakness. Not avoidance. Something harder. Something that required more than power. It's not the absence of conflict, he said. It's the decision to keep going, even when conflict tries to stop you. No one moved. Because now they weren't waiting for the speech to end. They were waiting to understand it fully. The attacker finally shifted. Just slightly. Not stepping away. Not resisting. Just adjusting. And that was enough. Because it meant the moment had reached him. The human acknowledged it without looking. Because acknowledgement didn't require attention. It required awareness. You wanted to be heard, he said again. Not repeating. Reinforcing. And now you are. A pause. But not the way you expected. The chamber held that line. Because it applied to all of them now. Not just the one who had acted. Every species present. Every system. Every belief. They had expected one outcome. They had received another. And that difference was the lesson. He drew in one more breath. Longer this time. Deeper. Holding it for just a fraction before releasing it in a controlled exhale. Resetting what little stability he had left. Then he straightened. Fully. For the first time since the shot. Not because the damage was gone. Because the message was complete. You invited a human to speak about peace, he said. Bringing it back. Closing the loop. So listen carefully. The chamber didn't just quiet. It locked in. Because now they understood that every word mattered. Not as speech. As proof. We don't stop when things go wrong, he said. We don't stop when it hurts. A pause. We don't stop when we're supposed to. Each line landed heavier than the last. Because none of it could be dismissed anymore. They had seen it. Measured it. Failed to explain it. And that's why this works, he finished. Because peace isn't built by those who end things. A breath. Final. It's built by those who refuse to. Silence followed. Not empty. Not uncertain. Complete. No one moved to interrupt. No one moved to respond. Because the outcome had already been decided. Not by force. Not by protocol. By continuation. And in that moment, they didn't see a wounded diplomat. They saw something far more difficult to confront. A species that didn't break when it should. Didn't stop when expected. Didn't end when forced. And that was far more powerful than anything they had prepared for.